Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 30th series of the Phantasm from the Logic of Sense. So Deleuze is going to tackle a concept that's been around since at least the time of Plato, the phantasm. But this is part of his project of overturning Platonism, because in Plato's philosophy, the phantasm was a departure from reality. It was an illusion. It was conceived of something negative. Whereas Deleuze will say that this is an intrinsic part of reality, that it actually he calls it transcends reality. And as such, he's going to draw a lot from the definition of phantasm and how it's looked at by Freud and Freudians like Melanie Klein and Susan Isaacs. This is a huge subject. It's not covered only in this series. The Phantasm is also, it's almost like a two-parter. It's covered in the 31st series on thought. And not only that, but all 5 pieces in the appendices have something to do with the phantasm. The appendices are divided into 2 sections, and the second section is more directly connected with the phantasm. It's called The Phantasm in Modern Literature, and he looks at pieces by Klosowski, Michel Tournier, and Zola in regard to the phantasm. The first section of the appendices is called the Simulacrum and Ancient Philosophy. And the simulacrum is, in this series, he's going to call it an object of the depths that is the pre-phantasm. So it goes into making the phantasm. The object of the heights he calls the idols, and the object at the surface he calls images. So these simulacrum idols and images will go towards making up the phantasm, and he looks at that in the next series, the 31st series on thought. Deleuze begins this series by saying that the phantasm has 3 characteristics. The first characteristic is that it represents a pure event. That is, it's not an action or a passion, but the resultant of an action and a passion. What he means by that is that it's something from the external, from outside, something from internal, a passion, and it's the combination of this. So as such, he'll say that the topology of a phantasm is where the outer meets the inner at the surface. The phantasm is an effect, and as such, it has an endogenous cause, an inner cause, an exogenous cause, something from the outside, but it also has a double causality. Along with the 2 inner and outer, there's also the quasi-cause, which is that it can be caused from another event or another phantasm, because he'll say that the phantasms, when they're brought to the surface, can communicate with other phantasms. Now, part of the problem that I have understanding this series, and possibly with some of the other series, is that Deleuze doesn't really give examples. He's just throwing out all this theory. And although Deleuze doesn't give any specific examples in this series, he does point to a book called Totem and Taboo by Freud, which he says is the great theory of the event. So presumably there's lots of examples in that book. This book is not only a psychological book, but also it's an anthropological book. I haven't read it myself, but you can get an idea of it by its rather, to modern ears, archaic full title, which is Totem and Taboo, Resemblances Between the Mental Lives of Savages and Neurotics. So obviously this is a Eurocentric point of view. We are hopefully a little more enlightened these days to not call indigenous people savages. But that's where his examples are. This is still part of what he's calling the dynamic genesis, but it seems to be no longer just the psychology of the infant coming into developing into the symbolic order or learning language. This seems to have to do with psychology at any age, as if the dynamic genesis, it's dynamic, so it never stops going. So a phantasm representing a pure event means that it represents sense. A pure event is the sense. And he'll say that psychoanalysis is the great science of events, so long as it doesn't try to extract the sense from the event, just looking at the event itself. So he'll say that a phantasm is neither real nor unreal, but rather you should make the distinction between the phantasm and its relation to a corporeal state of affairs. So how close this gets to a state of affairs. Deleuze is going to call the phantasm a noematic attribute. Noema is from an ancient Greek word. It means mental object. He's also going to relate this to a concept from phenomenology from Husserl called the noematic core, which is something that remains the same despite different intentional relations. For instance, an apple tree, you have the same idea of an apple tree, whether you are perceiving it, whether you're remembering it, whether you're judging it, whatever it is, you have this phantasm, this idea or this representation of the sense of an apple tree. That's the noematic core. So I'm going to attempt an example here about the causes of a phantasm. So let's say that someone has anxiety about riding in a car. Perhaps this resulted from the exogenous cause of them being in a car accident or witnessing a bad accident. The endogenous cause would be that traumatic incident that happened to them in the past from that exogenous cause. And the quasi-cause, which is a cause from another event, might be the event of someone saying, hey, let's go for a ride, let's go ride in the country or something, and that gives rise to their anxiety. Now, where psychoanalysis comes in is that psychoanalysis can effect a counter-actualization, that perhaps through therapy it can be worked out. So this person doesn't experience the same degree of anxiety every time someone says, let's go for a ride in a car. So the second characteristic of the phantasm is its relation to the phallic ego, or the phallic ego's position inside the phantasm. Again, coming from the model of psychoanalysis, Deleuze is going to say that the author of the phantasm is the phallic ego of secondary narcissism. Secondary narcissism is another Freudian term, which is when the attention is taken away from external objects and put upon the ego. The extreme examples of that is disinterest in the external world and a delusion of grandeur. It's all about the ego. This is where Deleuze is going to say the phantasm originates. And so this section on this characteristic is all about the basically psychoanalysis of this, because he'll say that the phantasm provides a movement that brings the ego to the surface, like outside of the depths of the phantasm, to the surface, and as such, it releases these singularities, these pre-individual, impersonal singularities from the ego. I think what he's talking about is, like, if, again, in the example of the anxiety, if the problem is brought to the surface, the individual can release these singularities that cause them to be anxious about riding in a car. And Deleuze is going to relate this to another Freudian concept called the narcissistic wound, which is just something that very emotional trauma. The third characteristic of the phantasm has to do with its relationship with language. He'll say that the phantasm does not exist outside of language, that that's how it gets expressed. But it's only initially related to a specific part of the proposition, which is the infinitive form of the verb. Now that is just a very general verbs, which examples are to run, the examples he gives in this book are to live, to absorb, to give. So in terms of language, Deleuze will say that because of the complex relations between the expressor and the expressed, or again, between the inner and the outer, between the infinitive verb in language and the infinitive verb in being, in actuality, we need to have a neutral infinitive, that's free of all grammatical determination, an infinitive independent of all persons, all times, all moods. And this general infinitive relates to his concept of the Aion. Now he's going to draw upon a feminist philosopher named Luce Irigaray, who wrote about the relationship between the infinitive verbs and the phantasm, and how she categorizes them between a pure general infinitive and as it comes down into more of a specific determination. And again, this seems to be the job of the counter-actualization brought about by psychoanalysis. That they, in my example, they speak of the infinitive verb to be anxious and try to determine what is causing this anxieties, to release those singularities. Deleuze will say that they get released like spores, that they just fly off and they unburden the subject. And coming to these grammatical determinations, this will be how Deleuze says the Aion gets populated by events at the level of singularities. This is how the Aion gets specified from being a pure abstract infinitive. So he doesn't talk at all about the relationship of the conscious and the unconscious in the formation of the phantasm. He's going to leave that to the next series, 31, on thought. And also he's going to more deeply examine the origin, the problem of the origin of the phantasm in that series. So from more of an esoteric side, I would say that this concept of the phantasm does not only have to do with psychoanalysis, but it basically is how we see the world. That the world, there's external events that go on, there's our internal programming, our internal beliefs about how we translate these external events, and the two sides touch and meet at the surface. So this relates to, in my opinion, the Hindu concept of Maya, or the Buddhist term samsara, or Sufis call it the dream. In other words, that what we conceive of reality is basically us putting it together in a large kind of phantasm. And where Deleuze differs from this mystical look at it is that he doesn't conceive of it as negative. It's just something. It's how we see the world. And if you read some of you'll get more ideas on the phantasm reading the appendices. And there he talks about the dissolution of the ego and how that relates to the phantasm, etc. So with all that, we'll see you next time for a continued discussion on the Phantasm in the 31st series on thought. Take care.